Today's talk is part of our lecture series, Conversations in Forest History. Our guest today is Karin Tilberg. Karin has a long career, and I'm emphasizing long because it is a remarkable career in environmental and natural resources law and policy matters. Her last job was serving as the president and CEO of the Forest Society of Maine, and she worked there from 2011 until retiring in November of 2024. She's the author of Loving the North Woods, 25 Years of Historic Conservation in Maine. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to our guest.
Thank you, Jamie. And thank you to all who are participating today. This is a huge honor for me to be invited to speak to the Forest History Society and be part of the Conversations in Forest History. It's a topic I love, and very interested in the organization as I've gotten to know more about it and preparing for this. I thank you for Dan Christensen for introducing me to the organization and to this wonderful opportunity. So as Jamie indicated, I've been working in forest conservation in Maine for at least 40 years, at least seems like. And at some point, about 8-9 years ago, I decided it was might be a good idea to try to chronicle a very significant period in Maine's forest history. But I'm going to do a screen share and first say a few words about Maine's North Woods. I know many of you are very familiar. It looks like from as you came into the webinar, I saw many of you who I know, and some looked like you had worked here in parts of your lives. But Maine's North Woods are incredibly special. So as I talk about Maine's North Woods, some of you again have probably deep familiarity, but it's an amazing, very large area of about 12 million acres. And actually, I need to ask Jamie, how do I advance this? Oh, there we go. Here's a slide of Maine, and the green area is largely considered by many as Maine's North Woods. It's about 12 million acres. And the yellow line that you see there is a line outlining Connecticut, the state of Connecticut. And you can fit 3.5 times the size of Connecticut in the 12 million acres of the North Woods. And that area is largely unorganized, meaning they're not formal towns or municipalities in this large area of land. There are probably about 9,000 to 10,000 permanent residents in this large area of 12 million acres. And it is extremely significant for wildlife, for fisheries, and for many ecological values. We have the last stronghold of wild brook trout in the rivers and streams and ponds in the North Woods, iconic creatures such as the pine marten, moose, and lynx. And this slide shows in red the National Audubon's designation of a global important bird area. And you can see that overlaps to a large degree the North Woods map I just had. And the green that you see here shows current portions of that have conservation status. But this is a globally significant forest. And it is, in fact, the least fragmented, intact forest east of the Mississippi River in the United States. So it's an intact and basically unfragmented from development, a very large extent area. There are a number of significant rivers that drain from this area, the St. John, the Allagash, the Penobscot, the Kennebec, the Androscoggin, and St. Croix, to name a few. And those largely flow into the ocean, and there's a deep connection between the Northwoods and the ocean, as many species inhabit both, and some move through the rivers to spawn, such as the Atlantic salmon. It is a dark sky area. Many parts of the area have been designated as dark sky places. It's the darkest sky east of the Mississippi River. And it's very important for carbon sequestration and storage. And a recent report documented that Maine's forests overall, and obviously this is a big part of Maine's forests, sequester 91% of Maine's greenhouse gas emissions every year. A huge important part of Maine's efforts to bring carbon emissions to net zero. So I'm just going to quote from some researchers that to emphasize what I've just been mentioning, that the Northwoods in Maine are the largest, most intact, contiguous temperate forest in North America, and perhaps globally, that has remained continuously forested since pre-settlement times. And so why did I write this book? I wrote it because I fell in love with the Northwoods. When I was a young woman, I taught backpacking in the Northwoods after college, and then working in Washington, D.C. On some environmental legislation. I came to the Northwoods to teach backpacking, and just found that it was sort of a home I never had found before, in terms of how much I felt my spirit relate to the place. And I know many of you who've spent time in the Northwoods perhaps understand what I'm trying to explain. And I should say, for those of you that, if you ever decide to buy my book, I have poems in between each chapter, and a few of them I try to articulate how much I care for and how much the Northwoods mean to me. But this book is really focused on history, a very particular part of the history of Maine's Northwoods from 1990 to 2015. It's not a long period of time, and it's about 25 years that this book focuses on. And during this period of time, the unimaginable happens. The starting point for the book is the late 1980s. And at that time, about a dozen, give or take, landowners owned the Northwoods. 12 to 15, or so large landowners owned the Northwoods. Most of them were paper company owners, and a few family ownerships, but paper companies such as International Paper, Great Northern, Georgia Pacific, Scott Paper, Seven Islands Pingree, Champion, Fraser, and a few others. And that had been the way things had been for quite a while, for almost a century, certainly close to a century, as paper company ownerships established and then grew and accumulated land. And many of these paper companies were vertically integrated in that they owned lands which supplied wood to their mills. They owned and operated paper mills. And many of them also had hydro facilities to help generate electricity for the mills. And the paper company economy was vital. It was just part of Maine. It was part of so many communities, part of life, and really defined a large part of who we were at that time. And I should just say that I am not a historian. I'm a wildlife biologist and a lawyer. And so I want to emphasize that I tried to capture this period of time through the best I could and to be fair. And there are no good guys or bad guys here. It's most trying to tell what happened and how people were experiencing this time. And it was quite a time. So this was the way life was. This is, people worked in mills, people worked in the woodlands, people, were part of forest economy chain, people worked, played in the North Woods, people enjoyed it. Then suddenly, truly, in a sudden spasm of activity, in less than 10 years, 9.1 million acres of this forest land changed hands. That's 9.1 million acres in less than 10 years in 34 transactions. And this is according to historians and economists that did track this. That's almost a half of Maine. It means about 20 million acres. And so I'm just going to read a little excerpt from my book to give you a sense of how this was rolling out at that time. On June 3rd, 1998, Sappy Fine Paper North America announced that it had placed all of its Maine timber holdings of 911,000 acres on the market. On October 6, 1998, Plum Creek Company announced its purchase of 905 acres from Sappy. On October 19, 1998, South Carolina-based Bowater Inc., formerly GNP, announced that it would explore selling a substantial amount of its 2 million acres of Maine forest lands and mills. On October 21, 1998, Bowater announced it was selling 911 acres of timberland. On November 2nd, 1998, Bowater announced that it was selling 656,000 acres of Maine forest land. On December 15, 1998, International Paper sold 185,000 acres. On February 24, 1999, International Paper announced its intention to sell another 245,000 acres. On April 26, 1999, Georgia Pacific announced that it was selling 446,000 acres of forest land. And in July 28, 1999, it was reported that Bowater would sell approximately 390,000 acres of its forest land. And then I'll just read one more because the list goes on for quite a while. On October 12, 1999, IP sold 245,000 acres of timberland. And I read those just to give you a sense of the rapid pace and large scale of these forest land sales that were taking place. And this, in retrospect, I think people began to understand more about why this was happening than at the time. At the time, it was very confusing. It felt very chaotic. And there were very complex reactions to this. But as we look back at that time, we understand that there were a number of huge forces at work here that resulted in paper companies deciding to sell their forest lands. There was greater and greater international competition for paper. There was also an increasing decrease in paper demand. There were tax law changes that reduced the benefits of owning forest land because it removed some benefits for capital gains that regular S corporations had. And the markets were changing, and the scrutiny on the forest land as part of the company gave rise to a sense that the land was a non-performing asset and that it was really not as essential to the overall operations that the companies could be able to get wood on the market or sell the land with wood supply agreements. And these forces came to bear all at once and in a very rapid way on so many of these paper companies that owned land in Maine. So who were the new owners as these 10 million acres of land were put on the market and sold? The new owners were a mix. There were timber investment management organizations, TIMOs, that pooled investors that acquired land that were placed on the market. There was at least one real estate investment trust that acquired forest land in Maine. And there were some very high net worth individuals that acquired land from these paper company sales. And so I just want to emphasize it. First of all, this wasn't just happening in Maine. These larger paper companies that held land across the northern forest, Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, New York, and into the northern states in the Midwest, we're selling their forest lands as well in these other states. But it was felt particularly in this northern forest area of Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and New York. And the confusion and the fear and the uncertainty of that time grabbed national attention. And we had the beginning then of a congressionally authorized Northern Forest Lands study that was done by the USDA, U.S. Department of Agriculture, and the Forest Service, to look at what all this meant. Because these states, these communities, the workers, the economies had become hinged to the way that the paper companies had owned land and mills and sometimes hydro assets. And what did this mean to have these new landowners come in? And what did it mean for the traditions and for the economies and also the ecology of the region? So the Northern Forest Land Study was commissioned, and it worked. It was overseen by a group of leaders from each state, and it came out with a report. But it really the outcome was not as effective, I guess is the best way to put it, as I think what people needed. People needed more time to understand this and a larger process of public involvement. And so one of the recommendations in the study was to have a Northern Forest Lands Council created, and that was created. And this was a more formal council that each governor appointed representatives from their state. This involved New York, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. And there was an intensive public involvement component, even more research on the causes and the possible outcomes of these massive sales of land, and some ideas for what to do next and how to move forward. And this was a very profound time. And I will say it was not an easy time. There were people that were very worried that this look by a congressionally approved study and council might lead to more federal lands and conservation. And that was of concern to many people. And then there were people who were hoping for more conservation and public lands. And there were people that kind of wanted some of both. But what really came through, especially to me looking back on that time, was the relationship that people had to the land, to their communities. No matter where you stood on what the perfect solution might be, there was a caring. People cared, and they had relationship with these forest lands and with the traditions. And that really shone through. And over time, people started to become more sharing and open to ideas and finding solutions. And so altogether, this was a 6-year process between the study and the council. But the council came up with a final report. And it was, I would say, fairly well received. And I'll just read the very first few sentences from the report. For its 1 million residents, this region is home. They have a connection to the land fewer and fewer Americans experience or understand. They have grown up hunting, fishing, trapping, and walking in the woods here. They are loggers, farmers, and business people. They work in the mills that have been the backbone of the region's economy for decades. Nearly 85% of the northern forest is privately owned and has provided a diversity of environmental and economic benefits. The economic viability of these private land ownerships is integral to community strength and overall economic health of the region. Some families have taken care of their forests and farms for generations. They have seen storms, droughts, great fires, and hard times. Living in the northern forest has often been difficult, but its people are proud of their endurance, their heritage, and a way of life so different than in the urban areas around them. And so I think that excerpt, for me at least, captured some of the heart and soul of the discussion that was taking place across the region and really captured what I think people in Maine were experiencing. So there was fear behind this. And, what people were afraid of was the division of the forest lands to be sold off in chunks that in time would mean that more lake fronts would be developed, that more roads would be brought into the North Woods, that second homes and utilities would be brought in, that the wildlife habitats would be fragmented and the wildness of the species composition and the health of this wildlife would be compromised. There was a fear that all of this would result in land being posted against trespassing. And that is a very important tradition in Maine, that big forest wildlands has traditionally been open to the people, to the public, to come on to the land, to walk on it, to hike on it, to hunt and fish on it. This is unusual in many other parts of the country and in the world, I know, but it's a basic kind of relationship that the paper companies had honored and had maintained. And would these new owners continue to honor and maintain this very significant tradition and relationship that resulted from it in Maine? And then there was a concern that if the land became divided and developed and fragmented, that the ability to manage it for forest products would be undermined over time. And so there was fear underneath all this. What were these new landowners going to do, and what would it mean? And so what the book then talks about and details is that people in these communities around the North Woods, working with their legislators sometimes, or just with each other, started to visualize what they hoped would happen, drawing on some of the larger discussions and recommendations in the Northern Forest Land Study. And there were a lot of different, what I call friends of groups that formed. And I'm talking about people over coffee and donuts in Jackman, Maine, in Greenville, Maine, in Grand Lake Stream, Maine, Dover, Foxcroft, meeting to say, what is this? What do these changes mean? What do these new landowners, what will happen here? And the amazing thing is that some good things came out of all this. And And I want to see if you can see this slide here, the different colors. Each of these colors represents a chapter in the book that discusses and describes in hopefully accurate enough detail conservation initiatives that arose during this time, this 20 to 25 year period of time. And so I'll just briefly list them. If you look at the blue, it's called the West Branch Conservation Easement in Seismic Unit, Maine project. And that involved a 282,000 acre conservation easement and a 42,000 acre acquisition by the state of Maine. So we're talking big numbers here. 282,000 acre conservation easement and 42,000 acre acquisition by the state of Maine. And that arose from the visioning of local people, the hard work of the Forest Society of Maine, the willingness of the landowner and land manager, and many state and congressional officials that work together to bring that about. If you look at the, let's look at the Pingree Forest Conservation Easement in sort of the brown. This was a family that didn't sell their land, but it was a family that was confronting the reality of new generations of family members, the desire to hold on to forest land overall and to continue to manage it. And they worked with the New England Forestry Foundation, and again, many others came into to play there to create a 762,000 acre conservation easement. And that's in the brown, and you can see there are different components to it. But that's 762,000 acre conservation easement. And I'll just in a minute emphasize what a conservation easement is. If you look at the, let's look at the Katahdin Ironworks with sort of an orangey color. This was a project that involved acquisition of land by the Appalachian Mountain Club in what's called the 100-mile wilderness area. And this was about 37,000 acres. It's actually their ownership now has grown to over 100,000 acres. And this is a particularly iconic recreation area. The 100-mile wilderness stretch of the Appalachian Trail runs through this area. And then there is the Debskin Eggs Wilderness and Katahdin Forest Conservation Easement in sort of a mustard color. And this is a 200,000 acre easement with a 41,000 acre acquisition by the Nature Conservancy with an easement on it held by the Forest Society of Maine. And then on the very right-hand side is the Down East Lakes Farm Cove Fee and Sunrise Conservation Easement. And that involved the 312,000 acre easement held by the New England Forestry Foundation and a 20,000 acre acquisition by the Down East Lakes Land Trust. Again, working with the landowner and a land manager and many others to stabilize that area that's very, very important for outdoor recreation. That area is renowned globally for its fishing. And there are more registered Maine guides in that Grand Lake Stream area than any other place, as I understand it. It's a particularly significant area for fishing and boating. And then last but not least, I'll just mention the yellow, which is the Moosehead Region Conservation Easement. And that is 359,000 acres of easement in the greater Moosehead Lake area. Now, each chapter talks about what happened, what the landowner who sold it, or the new landowner coming in, or in the case of the Pingree, what prompted the motivation to explore conservation. Each chapter talks about how local communities were involved in some of the stories. Almost every single project had moments when people were afraid that they were going to lose the project. Each of these cost a lot of money and a lot of funds, both federal, state, local, foundation, and individuals contributed to this. But the overall impact was, if these projects brought stability to unsettled, fearful communities and people. And I won't go into great detail, but conservation easements ended up being a particularly important tool for Maine. In a conservation easement, the landowner still owns the forest land and pays the appropriate tax on it. But they have transferred, in most cases, development rights to the holder of the easement. It's a legal document that's in the registry of deeds. Typically, it's a lasts forever. And the holder of the easement monitors the easement to be sure that the lands are not, if the easement prohibits development, then the holder makes sure that there isn't development. In many cases, the easements have a basic sustainability provision that the forest be managed sustainably, that development unrelated to forest management is prohibited, and that the lands must remain open to the public for pedestrian recreation or use. Again, going to those traditions that are so important. And there are some public acquisitions. I mentioned the state acquired some parcels, and some non-governmental organizations acquired some parcels. And it was a good recipe for Maine. People didn't want to see a massive shift to hundreds of thousands of acres of federal ownership, but key targeted ownership by the state was enabled by this. And the forests were that intactness, that undeveloped quality of that, and the openness for public access, and the darkness largely is now assured in a huge swath of area. And I just look at my watch here. I'll try to, Jamie, do I have like 3 or 4 more minutes?
Absolutely.
Okay. I want to say that it's kind of crazy when you think about it, that in this 20-year period, this slide shows in green the land that had conservation on it around 1990. And then in 25 years, we have this. So overall, including some other projects outside the Northwoods, Maine went from 5% of the state having some form of conservation to almost 20%, almost 4 million acres. And much of that was brought about by these creative and successful conservation projects that, again, were this amazing partnership of regular people in the towns and the gateway towns around the areas, state and federal officials, the landowners willing to do this, and funding of a variety of different sources that made all of this possible. I want to say that some people have said, are we done now? And everyone might have a different answer to that, but I will say that I think we should continue. If you go back to what I said at the very beginning about the uniqueness of Maine's unfragmented, intact forest that's continuing to serve Maine people through economic benefits, through carbon sequestration, through wildlife and fisheries, through being a bird sanctuary, as one researcher calls the North Woods. We should try to continue to work with landowners to hold on to this place. I don't think it will just stay this way on its own. It needs the love, caring, and the stewardship that all can bring to it. And the state, under our current governor, Janet Mills, commissioned a report called Maine Won't Wait, that says, we must, they call for trying to reach the 30% of Maine having some form of conservation by 2030. And I'm just quoting from it. It says, we must retain existing forest land and encourage climate-friendly forest practices that increase carbon storage and help forests become resilient to climate change. And if there's a question later, I know I'm running out of time, I can talk about the Debskineggs-Katahdin forest deal that kind of was symbolic of what happened during that era. But this just shows one of those projects, the Debskineggs-Katahdin forest. And I'm going to end by just saying that there's still new projects underway. This project was just announced about a month ago. And this is a collaboration with 4 organizations. If you look at the bottom, it says Forest Society of Maine, Rangeley Lakes Heritage Trust, the Nature Conservancy, and the Northeast Wilderness Trust, working with Wagner Forest Management on behalf of their owner. That will protect about 78,000 acres. And some of that will be managed, about 62,000, I think it is, will be managed as managed forest with a conservation easement on it. And the remainder will have very high protection of letting about 11,000 acres just let nature take its course as a wildland. And then some will be receiving special stewardship for fish restoration in a particularly important western part of Maine that is extremely important for cold water fisheries. So the beat goes on, it should go on. And as I end my book, I say that let's not dally in continuing to bring conservation to Maine's great North Woods. So let's see here. I thank you and I welcome questions.
Well, Karin, thank you so much for that. I do want to point out, for points of comparison, the Pingree easement is, the amount of land is about the same amount of land that is the, sorry, my brain got scrambled. The Pingree easement is the same acreage, give or take, as the state of Rhode Island has in acreage, including their waterways. But I mean, that's how much land, it matches the size of a state. And Karin, I appreciate that you had that early in the slideshow, the superimposing, what was it, Connecticut?
Connecticut, yes.
Over
You can fit 3.5 times the size of Connecticut in Maine's North Woods.
Yeah. So with that, and I mentioned Pingree because Mark Michaelos asks, how important was the Pingree deal in catalyzing the conservation movement in the North Woods?
I consider it extremely important. And up until the Pingree easement and the St. John project that the Nature Conservancy did, and I'm realizing I forgot to mention that when I was looking at all the projects, the St. John project was in there too. I think those two in particular broke what I call a glass ceiling of impossibility. That people kind of had this deep appreciation for the North Woods. They knew it was privately owned. But there was also a worry in the back of everyone's minds, what's going to happen down the road? Will this forest land stay forest land? Is there anything we can do to try to be supportive of keeping it as forest land? And when the Pingree family agreed to do this, and worked with Neff to do this, it just broke open that sort of fear and gave hope. It gave hope that there would be possible ways to work with landowners. They're all different, to try to find solutions that could retain the fabric of the forest and for the future. And so I felt that it was extremely empowering and inspirational. There were some naysayers, there always are, but overall, it was widely celebrated. And it was also a very low cost per acre when you consider an easement. It was all easement. And, it was, I think some people felt, well, we don't really need to worry about this. They're a good family. They won't divide and develop it. But I think they realized that the pressures of the next generation and an enlarging family and the commitment to the forest prompted them to want to do something. And that in turn inspired many people. So that project, and I think the TNC, let me just see if I can go back to that. The TNC project is sort of a purple color there. And I'm sorry, I didn't mention it earlier, but that project was an early one that also had that effect of inspiration and, that, yeah, maybe good things can happen here. So thank you for that question.
Sure. Dan Richter asks, has this wave of forest conservation, does this wave of forest conservation have a future? What do you think the future of forest conservation in the Northwoods might be? Do you think it'll keep going along this trajectory? We're in unprecedented times in a lot of ways. So, but a lot of the changes we're hearing about will be happening on federal land if they come to pass. So where would Maine and other states that are heavily private land centric, where do they fit in with all this?
I think that as the McGalloway project, I included that for that purpose, to say that there's still some sizable conservation projects underway. Landowners are still open to exploring conservation. And I think, again, the recipe that has emerged in Maine of a mix of easement and some targeted fee, some wildlands and some woodlands, seems to be working for landowners, for communities. And there's so much generosity. I think that there are some concerns about some of the federal forest funding programs, but there's a great deal of generosity, that because people care so much and recognize how important the Northwoods are.
Okay. Dan Christensen asks, I'll ask the question, and if it's more than you want to get into, that's fair. But he asks, how does the forest products industry, forest landowners, conservation community, and the public each benefit from a conservation easement? Maybe a different way of asking this is, generally speaking, what are the benefits of a conservation easement? Thanks,
Dan. Conservation easements are kind of a win-win-win-win strategy, in my opinion. First of all, it helps landowners hold on to their forest land. Most of them don't want to be in the business of dividing and developing their land. They want to manage for forest products. And that's costly. It costs money to own large tracts of forest land, to maintain the roads, to manage it. And so conservation easements typically are paid for. We always welcome donated ones, but the commercial forest landowners that we work with, that groups like the Forest Society where I used to work, typically you pay for them, and the landowner then is able to plow that back into their forest management, or depending on their goals. It's a benefit to them. And they also, I've had a number of forest landowners say it's a relief to be able to say, when people are knocking on their door, we can't sell our lots on our lakes. We have an easement on them. So it's beneficial to them. It's beneficial to the forest economy, workers, forest products, because you have stability and the forest fabric is there, and it can be managed to grow many different kinds of forest products. And so you don't have an unraveling forest base. The base is there. It can be managed as our society changes, our economy changes for different products. So it gives flexibility and stability. And then for the public, it provides, in most cases, access to beautiful lakes, streams, mountains, to hike and fish, to hunt, snowmobile, and millions of acres. And it ensures habitats for forest species that require big forests. So it's a win-win-win-win, in my opinion.
Okay. Somebody asked, so Dr. Jerry Franklin is a world-renowned forest researcher who's spent most of his career in the Pacific Northwest, responsible or credited with a lot of work on reshaping our understanding of forests as intact ecosystems. So a little bit of background there. And it is attributed to him that TIMOs and REITs may have effectively made the role of foresters obsolete. But what I'm hearing from you is, well, the land, at least in Maine and the North Woods, continues to be managed for these different purposes and values. But the person asks if you had a comment in response to Dr. Franklin's take on the TIMOs and REITs, maybe, I don't know, marginalizing might be the word, foresters. So a different way of asking that is what types of land management, forest management is happening there in the North Woods? Are you able to speak about that?
I'll speak at a high level. Yeah, I'm not a forester. I have an undergraduate degree in wildlife biology, and I'm a lawyer. So, but I do listen to what I hear. I try to stay connected to the forest community, both the conservation and more forest products related networks. So many of the TIMOs I know have foresters on staff and manage their forests. The McGalloway project, I showed the slide there, will have, I think it's a 62,000 acre easement that will be managed for forest, then by Wagner Forest Management, and they have foresters on staff.
Okay.
And other TIMOs in Maine have foresters on staff. And we also have some large landowners, individuals, if you will, that own sizable acres in Maine. The John Malone family owns about 1 million acres, and the Buck family has about 1.3 million acres, and J.D. Irving has about 1.3 million acres, and they all have foresters working for them. I think what I will say is the force that is, no one really knows the long-term effects of it now, are carbon sales. And landowners in Maine, are large commercial landowners, are exploring and entering into some carbon sales. And I think those typically still allow for forest management. So the foresters are still there, and that is a force that's newer and certainly will play out over time.
Somebody else asked, speaking of forest management, if you're aware of any American chestnut conservation projects happening up there?
Oh, there's so many people I know that are part of the American Chestnut Society and the hybridization and trying out species in different places. And the organization I just retired from has a plot, or some trees rather, on one of the parcels. So there's a high degree of affection for
Yeah.
that success of that species.
Well, speaking of the organization you retired from, somebody asked if you could briefly describe the Forest Society of Maine. And I actually appreciate this question because, we're the Forest History Society and we do no boots on the ground. We're a library and archive, no boots on the ground activities, no easements, nothing like that. We are documenting history. So what is it that the Forest Society of Maine does?
The Forest Society of Maine was established about 40 years ago, not as young compared to you.
Mhm.
But we were created really essentially to hold conservation easements on forest lands. And initially we were kind of a subsidiary of the New Hampshire Society, Forest Society, Society for the Protection of New Hampshire Forests, SPINIF is its acronym.
Mhm.
But then we're sort of birthed into our own entity, and we are an easement holder. We are a land trust. We're the land trust for the North Woods is our moniker. And we hold about 1 million acres in conservation easement in Maine. And that's what our focus has been, and I think remains our key focus, working with forest landowners who want to hold on to their land, but not see it developed and divided and built upon and held on for all the reasons that we've been talking about.
Okay. Roger Merchant asks if you'd be
Roger.
willing, you'd be willing to speak to the role that NAFTA has played in contributing to the divestment of forest land. Now, he says among the 9 historic corporate landowners, but if you want to just speak to the impact of NAFTA and trade starting in the 1990s, that would be much appreciated.
Oh, Roger, so Roger is a very renowned forester and forest historian
Okay.
in Maine. And Roger, I am not an expert in NAFTA. I don't know that I can really say much to your question. I think what I feel comfortable saying is that there was this shift in valuing forest land as part of a ownership by mills, paper mills, that it had been seen as a benefit, and it was highly valued, even though it was not generating money for the companies. It was a solid part of who they were as a corporation. And they could pull wood from it when they needed, and they were managing, all these paper companies were managing their forest land. Some were investing, doing a lot of long-term investment, plantings and different approaches to forest management, species. They all thought, the workers there thought this is for the long haul. And then bang, all of a sudden, the land was like, nope, it's a non-performing asset, we got to sell. And it happened in like 7-9 years. And after that period of time, no paper companies own land in Maine. The mills all were getting, either they had wood supply agreements or they got it on the market directly. But it was, I don't know if NAFTA played in that. And that's where I just don't have the knowledge you do, Roger, to even try to answer that. But it was so, like, even the economists like Lloyd Erlin said, even, people that were following the forest industry didn't see it coming. It was so sudden and so massive.
So thank you for taking a stab at that.
I'm sorry, Roger.
Caroline asks, and I really appreciate that she's asked this question because of the way land ownership is in Maine. She says, do you work with the tribes? I don't know if she's asking about you specifically, individually, or the Forest Society of Maine, but can you talk about the relationship between tribal lands and private land ownership a bit?
Yes, thank you for that question. So my little book is just 25 years of Maine's forest, a history of the forests in Maine. But really the forests in Maine go back, 12,000 years. And the ancestors of the Wabanaki, the tribes now are, in Maine, had a relationship that began 12,000 years ago as the forests of Maine took hold after the glaciers retreated. And they and the forests evolved together. And that relationship is so powerful and so important. I didn't write about that because I don't have the knowledge. But it's so important to remember that. I do have a chapter that touches on that. And I think there's a resurgence, or at least maybe not resurgent, an upwelling of what appreciation and a desire to support that relationship of the Wabanaki and the forests. And it's through the land trust community, through many different communities. And so I'll just speak to the Forest Society where I just left, but there was a strong commitment by that organization and by many other land trusts to try to be very mindful of, respectful of when a landowner came to us to do an easement, to try to involve or learn from Wabanaki about their relationship with that piece. Was there something we could do to involve them in a project, or to be sure always that the easement would never preclude their ability to gather on the land, or to have ceremony on the land, or to have a relationship with the land. And we're still learning how we're all learning.
Yeah.
The key is that people are trying very hard to be supportive of that ancient relationship and to be mindful of it. And I think another important part of this is connecting forest landowners with tribes. And so again, I know the organization I just retired from was trying to facilitate those kinds of relationships and getting people together more. But thank you for that question. It's very important.
Yeah, and that's also, as there were questions about the future, and that's all. The Wabanaki and others are one of the many parties involved in all of this, and so it's what I admire about what's been accomplished in Maine is the communication, the cooperation, and the collaboration that's gone into this effort to make such a difference. And I'm hoping that that's a model that can be emulated elsewhere. So
yes, and I think more and more when opportunities arise, the land trust community is trying to work with. There's a land return program for the tribes to see if parcels that might be on the market or going on the market might be really important to them for their cultural needs and their own history, if you will, and to try to work to connect the land and the people, and there's joy in that. It's joyful work if that can happen.
well, on that very happy note, Karin, thank you for today, for the presentation, and for tackling those questions.